In 2020, we've all asked the same question: what's next? At Arizona State University, Next is launching a virtual classroom unlike any other. Next is finding new ways to learn for students of all ages. Next is making sure those who need COVID tests get them. With ASU Innovation, it's time to look forward to what's next.
The human brain is the most complicated object in the known universe. It's more complicated than the working of a star. It's more complicated than solar systems. It's more complicated than the objects in galaxies.
I have a dream.
I can't imagine that nature, whatever you believe, nature or the creator, put that thing between your two ears so that you would use some tiny percentage of it. I can't believe that that's the case. The notion of education being for a few people, that's absurd. That is literally absurd. Our why, our reason for existence, is to construct the public university which is serving the success of the democracy, the success of the people and their families directly, with intent, with purpose, with differentiation, with responsibility, with measurement, with creativity, with all the things that we can bring to bear. That's what this is about.
If you think about the audaciousness of that an institution says it's going to take fundamental responsibility for society, for someone like me, I want to be part of that.
Every single one of us is a one of a kind. We exist on Earth for this brief period of time, and that one unique opportunity that you have cannot be wasted. It needs to be maximized to its fullest extent.
What does it mean for us to be able to say, we have something for you, specifically for you and for the 6 other people in your small town? I think that's one of the things that gets missed, is the fact that we can reach 10 million people or we can reach 10 people. And all of them get the same kind of engagement from us and the same kinds of commitments to say, we want to help you create a future of your own making.
Access and excellence. We need to give access. We need to create inclusive communities, but it's because that's going to make us all more excellent in our sciences and in our ability to use our scientific knowledge to solve grand challenges.
The dual pursuit of access and excellence is not just operationally expedient, it's not just economically expedient, it's not just fiscally expedient, it's morally expedient. It's the path to a meaningful social progress for this country and for the world.
To take an institution and reorient it to a social impact is something that is what universities should be about, but we've forgotten about.
I think we're at a time where higher ed has to transform. We have to. We can't keep going with our old ways. And I think that ASU is incredibly well positioned to make that change as we lean into the future.
We have to take on responsibility. So this notion of taking on responsibility is really, really important.
We have to change the world now. We have to change it now. We cannot wait. And ASU is the place that says, you have to change it now. What do you need to take it to the next level?
It is important that we have models. It is important that young people look and say, oh, I belong there. So that gives me great joy and the responsibility of knowing that it's my shoulders they're going to stand on. I often tell them, I'm just holding the space for you. I am holding the space for you. And when you're ready, I'll be ready to go.
I felt like I was bringing my personality and like my value to this school, and I felt like I was a part of something that was going to be really big.
My voice has been something that I have discovered within the years, and it's something that I will forever be grateful.
what you can achieve here is limited only by your imagination.
It's a really unique situation to be here at ASU. It's like being in the front seat of the educational revolution.
What we learn here has the potential to influence the entire globe and humans living everywhere.
What would make me happiest would be that the cultural changes are so dramatic that the institution continues to design and redesign and morph its design going forward and becomes this truly adaptive institution, really working on social outcomes rather than working on individual university or individual faculty outcomes. What drives me is this notion of the individual human and the individual human mind being able to become this powerful force. You know, we've dreamt about this in art and literature and culture for thousands of years, and we're just now to the point where I'm 100% convinced that we can make it happen.
Greetings from Tempe. My name's Brian Brayboy, and I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe and director of the Center for Indian Education. I want to welcome you to our webinar series. I'm really thrilled with what the team has put together over the coming months as we begin to do this. So let me tell you how we got here. A few years ago, we started planning the 60th anniversary for our center. And as we emerge into our 61st and then our 62nd year, in the midst of planning for this, we had a global health pandemic that exposed many other things along with it as well, which really forced us to rethink what we wanted to do. And while we wanted to gather in person, it did not seem the prudent thing for us to do. But we also didn't want to miss a Diamond Jubilee. How many research centers actually celebrate a 60th anniversary? So we decided we were going to do this series of webinars and conversations that are really focused both on the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous education. And so that's how we ended up here. I'm really glad that you have decided to join us for one or all of these. They're going to be exciting and interesting, and I know that the team has put a lot of thought into them. Let me back up again. I am coming to you from Tempe, which sits on the ancestral homelands of the Acamel-O'odham and Peepush peoples. There were certainly other communities, other tribal communities and peoples who utilized the space because of the verdant river that was really flowing through here, that flowed all the way to the Sea of Cortez. So we're coming to you from that and recognize that with this recognition, there's a certain level of responsibility that the institution has to those peoples. And in some ways, that's where the Center for Indian Education comes in. We were founded in 1959 at the time to really try to meet the educational, cultural, and social needs of tribal communities and children. And to be perfectly honest with you, 61 years later, that's precisely what we intend to do. Our scope is widened. We serve the 22 tribal nations and communities in what is now the state of Arizona, but we have partnerships across the U.S., and we've got partnerships in Canada and in New Zealand and Australia and other places that are emerging. So we have gone global in some ways, but really our heart is in Arizona and in the U.S. in terms of the work that we do. We continue to want to serve the educational, social, and cultural needs of tribal communities. Importantly, our job is to work with those communities to create futures of their own making. We don't determine what those futures are. What we have is a particular capacity to be able to do research, to write policy, to think about other kinds of work, and we bring those assets to communities in service to them. It is one of the unique hallmarks of our center that has been around for 61 years. We host the Journal of American Indian Education, which is now it's about to enter into its 60th volume year, which is a pretty remarkable thing. We set policy, we write policy papers for different organizations, some affiliated with tribal governments, some with the federal government in the U.S., others for private foundations, and others for scientific organizations. We train students, we prepare Indigenous students to go out and create a future of their own making, but many of them are focused on also making meaning and making futures for their own tribal nations. That's a really important piece of what we do. And as I said, we publish the journal. So we are focused on research, policy, and publication, and remain doing that, and really hope that we will do that for the next 60 years as well. I've had the pleasure of being the director of the center, co-director or director of the center since 2009, and we'll look forward to transitioning at some point in the near future. Without any further ado, I want to thank our sponsor, the Spencer Foundation, for their generous support being able to do this work. And I'm really just so excited about the work that and the webinars that you will be engaging in. So welcome Take care of yourself, and looking forward to when we can gather again in person. Take care.
Greetings. I'm Teresa McCarty, Faculty in Education and American Indian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and I'm speaking to you from the beautiful lands and waterways of the Gabrielino Tongva people in what is known in Spanish and English as Los Angeles and the South Channel Islands. It's my privilege to formally introduce the moderator of this third webinar commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Center for Indian Education, Dr. Brian McKinley Jones Brayboy, whom I've known as a colleague and friend for more than 20 years. A citizen of the Lumbee Nation, Dr. Brayboy is President's Professor in the School of Social Transformation at ASU, where he also serves as Vice President of Social Advancement, Senior Advisor to the ASU President, Director of the Center for Indian Education, and co-editor of the Journal of American Indian Education. Prior to coming to ASU, he was visiting President's Professor of Indigenous Education at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and on the faculty of the University of Utah. Dr. Brayboy is internationally known for his seminal articulation of tribal critical race theory and his field-shaping scholarship on higher education for Native students, Indigenous knowledge systems, and culturally responsive schooling for Indigenous peoples. He's been president of the Council on Anthropology and Education within the American Anthropological Association, and he's a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and a member of the National Academy of Education. He's been a visiting distinguished scholar in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. With more than 95 scholarly publications to his credit, Dr. Brayboy has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Rosa Parks Award from the American Association for Access, Equity, and Diversity, the Mike Charleston Award for Distinguished Contributions to Indigenous Education from the AERA Indigenous Peoples of the Americas SIG, and ASU's Distinguished Sustainability Scientist Award. In all of his work, he has illuminated the critical role of tribal sovereignty in Native American and Indigenous education. Perhaps most significantly, though, he has made a profound difference in redressing the education disparities his scholarship calls into question, garnering millions in funding for research-based culturally responsive programs that have prepared more than 165 Native teachers and more than 20 American Indian PhDs. Dr. Brayboy, we thank you for your impactful and inspiring leadership, your commitment to giving back and forward to Indigenous communities, and for guiding our conversation today.
Thank you, Dr. McCarty, for your introduction and for your friendship over the past 2.5 decades. I owe so much to you and Professor Loma Waima, both personally and professionally. Indeed, I'm the beneficiary of your mentoring and support. I'm also grateful to you both for your care and for the generosity of your spirit and time. And thank you for your leadership in making this celebration of 60 years of Indigenous excellence a reality in this very challenging past year. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the third of 5 seminars celebrating the 60th year of the Center for Indian Education, the CIE, at Arizona State University, celebrating all that CIE represents for the field of Indigenous education. I want to thank all the dedicated staff, students, staff, and faculty serving on CIE's 60th Planning Committee, and especially CIE Assistant Director, Dr. Colin Ben, who will be reading questions from the audience during the question and answer period. We're grateful to we are grateful to work with and for the Indigenous peoples of this place and many others. Thanks to all of you all who are live streaming. You can submit questions and comments to the chat, or for those of you watching on ASU Live, please submit questions to the School of Social Transformation YouTube website, ASU-SST-YouTube. The top window has the title of the event, Building Legacy of Excellence in Indian Education plus Live. I want to honor the physical and cultural landscape where I'm privileged to live, the homeland of the Akimel-O'odham and Peeposh peoples. They are the descendants of the Hohokam, who several thousand years ago constructed canals that crisscross the Phoenix Valley. These canals were and continue to be engineering marvels, transporting water in some cases uphill. They made the valley a hot, arid place, verdant, livable, and an amazing place to live for themselves and for their descendants, and frankly, for the rest of us. You can still see the pattern of many of these canals when you fly in and out of the Phoenix Valley. They are now the Central Arizona Project's canal system that transport water across the vast valley where almost 5 million people currently live. Akimel-O'odham and Peeposh peoples are still in the valley. They are doctors, stay-at-home moms and dads, farmers, lawyers, students at ASU, and many other things. They are the caretakers of the lands their ancestors stewarded. It's my profound honor today to introduce today's panelists. I have long-term relationships with all three of them. They've been friends and colleagues, mentors and guides. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. We have an opening question to which each panelist will take about 5 minutes to respond. Then we look forward to a rich back and forth dialogue among the panelists. And then after that, the time reserved for Q&A dialogue, responding to questions and comments from you all, our audience. Welcome to you all. We are so pleased to have you with us today in this virtual space. Dr. Megan Bang is Senior Vice President at the Spencer Foundation and Professor at Northwestern University, is a mother, grandmother, and auntie of Indigenous children from the Great Lakes, including Canada, where her family is origined, to Navajo land in Arizona. She received her PhD in Learning Sciences from Northwestern University in 2006. She's interested in intergenerational transfer of knowledge in and through place between youth and elders. She's had over $20 million in grants to support her research, has been an incredible mentor to Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, and a strong community advocate in both Seattle and Chicago. Her work with urban Indigenous populations is informative and insightful, and she's been at the forefront of connecting learning sciences, culture, and Indigenous knowledge systems. Dr. Bang is a former preschool teacher and an educator of all ages, including myself. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bang. Dr. Susan Faircloth, an enrolled member of the Coharie Tribe of North Carolina, and our families have known each other for over 1,000 years. We were, a few decades ago, reviewers for a grant competition. We would both later become PIs in that program. And I remember at the time sort of thinking, this woman has got it going on. And she does. She is professor and director of the School of Education at Colorado State University, having earned her degree in educational administration from Pennsylvania State University. She's published widely in such journals as Educational Administration Quarterly, Harvard Educational Review, the Journal of Special Education Leadership, Tribal College Journal of American Indian Higher Education, Rural Special Education Quarterly, and the Journal of Disability Policy Studies. She's one of the rare individuals who writes, she may be the only individual, quite frankly, who writes about special education and disability studies, educational leadership, and early childhood education. Dr. Faircloth serves as a senior associate editor of the American Journal of Education, a member of the editorial board of the Journal of American Indian Education, and chair of the technical review panel for the National Indian Education Study. She's a former Fulbright Senior Scholar to New Zealand, Ford Foundation postdoctoral scholar with the Civil Rights Project at the University of California, Los Angeles, research fellow with the American Indian Alaska Native Head Start Research Center at the University of Colorado, Denver, and a recent William C. Friday Fellow for Human Relations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Faircloth. Dr. Jeremy Garcia is an assistant professor of Indigenous education in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Studies at the University of Arizona. He is of the Roadrunner clan and a member of the Hopi-Tewa tribes of Arizona. He is a co-founder and co-director of the Indigenous Teacher Education Program. Prior to joining U Arizona, He was an assistant professor at the School of Education and an endowed professor of the elective Quenny Institute for American Indian Education at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Grounded in critical Indigenous research methodologies, his research focuses on decolonization, critical Indigenous curriculum and pedagogy, Indigenous teacher education, and critical culturally sustaining family and community engagement. Dr. Garcia continues to support tribal communities, educators, and programs with curriculum development that centers Indigenous knowledge systems, such as the Hopi Kuwa curriculum and the Hopi Natwani curriculum in Arizona. Dr. Garcia is currently working with Hopi educators to develop curriculum based on the published volumes Moki and Castellum, Hopis, Spaniards, and the Trauma of History. He received his PhD in curriculum studies from Purdue University. While at Purdue, he held a vital role in the development of the first Native American Educational and Cultural Center at Purdue University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Garcia. In the first webinar, Terry McCarty, my friend, mentor, and co, outlined a really nice history of the center, and I want to borrow liberally from that history. In 1959, in what is now known as Arizona, we'd been a state for only 47 years, while more than 22 tribal nations and communities had occupied these lands since time immemorial. The US Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education was 5 years old, with not a trace of school desegregation on the horizon, particularly in Indian education. A cascade of bills to terminate tribal sovereignty and seize more Indian land churned through Congress, and the federal government had launched a coercive Indian relocation campaign. In 1959, ASU had just changed its name from Arizona State College to Arizona State University. And here I borrow from my colleague and mentor, Kay Chanina Loma-Waima's introduction last month. In Terry's eloquent words, and I'm quoting here, it was a time of entrenched racism and colonialism, but also a time to dream and to act, end quote. Dr. Robert A. Russell Jr. and his wife, Ruth Russell, who is Dene, and other Native leaders and grassroots tribal citizens established at ASU what would become the first center for Indian education research, teaching, and outreach in the US. Robert Russell and one of the center's first students, Dr. Peterson Zaw, who would go on to become the first Navajo Nation president, wrote this about the center's mission: Native communities in action for Native American self-determination. Each of our panelists have, in their own and overlapping ways, engaged with tribal communities to engage in forms of self-determination. 62 years after the founding of the center, there has been a move to indigenize education and institutions. That is our focus in today's webinar. So I'm going to begin today by asking panelists to take about 5 minutes to address this question. Do you think it's possible or appropriate to indigenize the academy, or are we doing or pursuing something else? Dr. Faircloth, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Dr. Brayboy. I was hoping that I would go second. I'm happy to try to answer the question, but I think before I do that, I would also like to just give honor and recognition to the Indigenous lands in which my institution, Colorado State University, rests. And just to tell a brief story about that. So Colorado State University is a land-grant institution, and it's located on the ancestral homelands of the Ute Mountain, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho peoples. And it also was the site of trade and travel of many other Indigenous groups from across the nation. For me, I share this story with my faculty, staff, and students each time we have a gathering, that I came to Colorado State University 2.5 years ago from my home state of North Carolina. And in coming to Colorado State University, it was almost a 360 process of coming back to the beginning, because my husband and I had adopted a baby girl. She's now 11 years old, and her name is Journey, but we had adopted her when she was a day old, and she's from the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation of Oklahoma. And so when we came back to Colorado State, it was almost a coming home, right? A coming full circle, because we had the opportunity to work on the lands of my daughter's people before they were forcefully removed and relocated to Oklahoma. And so each time that I step foot on the grounds of my institution, I'm reminded that the work that I'm most passionate about, the work to ensure that Native children and youth have all types of possible futures, and that their educational conditions and ultimately their life outcomes are everything that they should be. The ability to do that work and to live out my life's passion, and to do that work centered in a place that's located on the traditional homelands of my daughter's people. For me, that is just such powerful work, right? And every day that I come to campus or that I think about that work, I am deeply reminded that, yes, this institution pays my salary, but this institution does not determine who I am as a scholar, or the ways in which I do my work, or the ways in which I live out my work. And that this work goes way beyond academia. And there are many days that I feel like I hold up and pick up and hold up that challenge, and I do honor to it. And there are equally as many days that I feel I fall short, right? That I'm not doing this work in a good way, that I give in to the organizational structures and demands of an institution that was not built for Indigenous peoples. It was not built for us. It was not built to serve our needs. And in many cases, Indigenous peoples, as well as African Americans, Blacks, these institutions were built on our backs. And so I come to this work with the knowledge that these institutions were not built for us. They were not built with us in mind. And so when I think about that question, is it possible to indigenize these institutions? I draw on a quote that I saw earlier today, and it comes from a book, Indigenizing the Academy. And this was really powerful to me. It says, the Academy has much invested in maintaining control over who defines knowledge, who has access to knowledge, and who produces knowledge. And so I go back to that notion of control, right? And as Indigenous intellectuals committed to our Indigenous nations, we threaten the power and authority claimed by these institutions, by our disciplines, and by the peoples who created those disciplines, in part from the oppression of our people. And so I think it's not a simple question, right, of whether or not we can indigenize these spaces and these places, or whether or not we should. But I think for me, I would not be in a predominantly white institution, and this is the fourth institution that I've been in, if I did not believe in the power and possibility of indigenizing some aspects of these institutions. But I do that work. I was having a conversation with my husband this morning about being a troublemaker, right? And getting in trouble. And he said, well, you tend to get in good trouble. And so I thought about John Lewis and his notion of good trouble. And I thought, as long as I remain in this space, I will always be in a place of good trouble, because I never want to get to a place where I feel complacent or comfortable or complicit in these institutions that were built to threaten our very existence, in an institution that could not have been built if it were not for the forceful removal, displacement, and in many cases, the killing of my daughter's people, right? And so it's not a place that I ever want to feel completely comfortable in. And so, yes, I think there are possibilities and opportunities to indigenize aspects of these institutions, but I think to have a truly indigenized institution, that only can exist outside the confines of these institutions as they currently exist. I think there are great opportunities to do that through colleges and universities, like tribally controlled colleges and universities, which I've had a long history with. My first job out of my doctoral program was working with the American Indian Higher Ed Consortium. And it was within the space of just a few days that I unlearned everything that I had learned in graduate school about how to work in and with Indigenous communities. And I'll forever be indebted to that opportunity. So yes, I think there are opportunities and places and spaces and ways in which we can indigenize aspects of these institutions. But I don't want us to be limited to the existing institutions. I want us to always live in a space of thinking about possibility and something that can be bigger and better and more just than what currently exists.
Thank you, Dr. Faircloth. Lots to chew on there. Dr. Garcia, I want to go to you.
Okay, hi, yes, thank you. I just want to extend my appreciation and the invitation to be with you all and to engage not just with my colleagues here who are sharing and talking story, but also those who are watching and probably swirling in their own thoughts about what these questions are offering. But I also want to congratulate you all in the center for the success, long-standing success that is had. And I know many of the people from the previous presentations have been great mentors to myself as well, and I probably will highlight them eventually, such as Dr. John Tipikanik, who was on my dissertation committee, Dr. Chinina Lomoaima, who assisted us with the creation of the center in terms of her presentation that coming to Purdue with the late Hartman Lomoaima, and also, you know, just your work as well, the collective, all of you here, Dr. Brayboy and Dr. Bang and Dr. Faircloth. So I'm really excited to certainly be here. And obviously the other work that I have is working with Dr. David Bolio with the American Indian Lectoquini Institute. So I'll kind of speak to some of those experiences that really helped shape my understanding of these particular questions and the series of dialogues that will happen here. But I too am coming from the ancestral homelands of the Tohono Nation, as well as the Yoeme peoples. And so I'm really glad to see that, you know, that they continue to welcome us to these homelands and also demand some levels of accountability as the University of Arizona rests on their particular homelands. But it's also personal to me because I know that as a Hopi, that we do have migration stories that connect us all. So I carry that with me in the work that I do. And I know that there's a long-standing history of our existence throughout this whole region and even down into Mexico. So that said, I think the question for me is that, you know, I think it is possible, but I think whether we have to think through whether it is appropriate. And so I appreciate Dr. Faircloth, your words about problematizing and really speaking to the structures that exist, and they were really there to erase our existence. And I think that's the tension that I have about the ways in which we name the work we do and whether it does or whether it should exist within these particular institutions. So for me, you know, I think it depends on really asking ourselves and teasing out the term indigenizing. What does that mean for who and what does it look like? And so for me, I think for being that I am Hopi and I do the best that I can to be in relationship to that place. I grew up there, continue to participate in the ceremonial and cultural practices. And so as I'm thinking about that very question about what does it mean for me, I think about my time when I am engaging in ceremony or attending cultural practices and the messaging and the levels of experiences that are embodied in such a place, even down to the ideas of planting corn and that process. All of those specific things shape my identity and really my own conceptualization of what I think is indigenizing. And so for me, it's grounded in, you know, guided by the epistemologies that are driven by our values, our own philosophies, our stories of emergence, our relationships to land and waters, and the roles and responsibilities defined by our clan affiliations. Dr. Brayboy, you mentioned that I'm of the Huspungwa, which is the Roadrunner clan. So in Hopi, there's multiple clans, and so there's shared knowledge systems and expectations about what that means. And so that all said, when I look at conceptualizing that within my own personal identity, you know, I come to the question of, so what does that mean when I arrive at an institution? And like Dr. Faircloth, I've been at several institutions, and so each of them are unique based on place, based on their origins, based on, you know, their identity. The institutions carry a unique identity as well. So every time that I think about coming into a place where being Hopi and attending Purdue University, you know, it's a different landscape. So I grappled with my time there in terms of the fact that, well, it was home to the origins of, you know, the Ku Klux Klan, for example, and to be told that bluntly, there's a level of hesitancy of interacting with these particular institutions because of that the racism that it's grounded within. But I think when we are entering institutions that are driven by settler colonial logics and structures, we have to recognize that that is not ours. It is a place designed for someone else and for something else, for some other bigger or other purpose. And I think that you know, colonial structures are driven by capitalism. And so, you know, it is critical for us to understand such structures and goals, and in doing so, notions of indigenizing the academy take on new meaning. And I mean, in particular, I share all that just to say that I know I'm immersed in it as well. It's benefited me in certain ways. You know, the fact that it pays for my salary, the fact that it gives me access to different kinds of resources. And I think that's where the level of accountability rests on my part, is how do we reassure that our knowledge systems are being cared for, that they're not being extracted or utilized in different ways that actually do further harm. So with that, I just kind of have actually raises more questions for me. So what aspects of indigenizing the academy fall victim to reinforcing settler colonial agendas that only furthers the exploitation and extraction that institutions through research have historically imposed on indigenous peoples? And the last question I'll ask is that what kinds of logics and relationships are being created through indigenizing the academy? And I think when I swirl in those particular questions, I left to think about the ideas of, for me, reciprocity, relationality, and accountability to indigenous communities. And so I think there's a level of caution when at the end of the day, with this idea of indigenizing, that we have to take care of and be mindful of. And then a last thing I'll say here before I end is that these really came to me in my own research, that I did with indigenizing curriculum and pedagogy and working with Native communities, in particular my own Hopi community. There were contentious moments where there was information that shouldn't be placed in the textbook, that shouldn't be placed or documented. So when you think about that, it really raises cautionary, reminders for myself in terms of when we say indigenizing the academy, what are the protective parameters that we have to be mindful of?
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Dr. Bang.
I'll just start by saying thank you for this opportunity, for being here together, and just I'm slightly overwhelmed by how important this feels, and the series and the work that CIE has done, and the scholarship that my colleagues have done, and actually I want to say how they've done that work, as well as just recognize that the opportunity to come to each other in this dialogue from our different places. I'm coming from what many people think of as Chicago, but is actually the ancestral territories of my own people and the Three Fires people, and is a place that people have always come from to trade, to share medicine, to take care of each other. And so at this time of COVID, when I get to do that all the time, has been an interesting thing, that we get to come together in this way. And so I just want to say thank you for that. Thank you for the space. I also want to say that Susan and Jeremy just brought us to places that I'm even more excited to be in this conversation now. Because when Brian asked me, and I said, but Brian, I don't know that I'm down with indigenizing the academy, so am I really the right person? And I'll say, for all of the complexities and possibilities that Susan and Jeremy just articulated, I'm there with you. And I think one of the things that I continually grapple with is, and part of what I hear in this is, these institutions weren't made for us. In fact, they were made based on our ontological harm and denial as peoples. And so what does it ask of us to think that we should indigenize those things? And for me, I want to say that this question, I'm a preschool teacher at heart. I actually am quite shy and don't enjoy being around lots of adults. But I would offer that when I think about this question, I immediately say, are we talking about indigenizing schooling? And so I think some of the questions and the issues that just got raised, I'm not sure that they're only of the academy. Are they as equally of first grade or third grade? And I mean that in formalized schooling places. And I think that one of the things that I think a lot about, I think I'm in a phase where I don't think we should be indigenizing the academy. I do think that we should be saying no more harm, that you don't get to perpetuate harm. And I think that our presence in these places and our leadership in these places is actually fundamental to being able to accomplish that. And part of why I'll say that is because I think that the trend that I've seen over the last couple of decades is starting to feel more and more extractive. I've said this a couple times in different conversations. It's starting to feel like they want all of our brilliance, but none of our presence as a paradigm of indigenizing the academy. And I heard that both in Jeremy and Susan, what you were saying is a kind of potential harm. Where does it belong? Where do our own knowledge systems belong? And I'm increasingly pretty certain that I don't think that that's what is of the academy or should be of the academy. But I also say this, I also have spent enough time, and I actually think about, speaking of long-term mentors, is an experience I had in Alaska with Oscar Coagley, that Brian, you were one of the organizers. And I remember him talking about that we're in a time where we need all of our knowledges. We need all of our languages. We need all of what we bring because of the challenges in front of us. So part of the reason I raise that is because I battle a little bit with myself about what it means to make this decision from a place of starting with the colonial harm as what Scott Lyons calls the kind of rhetorical grounds from which we ask the question. And so I on the one hand, and you know, I have a love-hate relationship with the academy. I really love having the idea of a profession where I get to read and write. I'm a nerd that way. What I'm supposed to read and write often feels like a violent ask. And so at the same time, though, I think a lot about what would it mean to create the possibilities in which it wasn't based in kind of claims to epistemic supremacy, claims that some knowledge systems are better or should be the thing that are disseminated in particular kinds of ways. And I guess I'll say this because for me, I am an accidental academic. I'm an accidental college graduate. This is not the future that I had imagined. It is not a future that most people in my family have. And so I often think about the many gifts that have come because I've also walked down this path. And for us, we have stories about that our resurgence will come in unexpected ways if we're paying attention. And that one of the things that I think a lot about is what are we learning about what gets to claim our attention, what gets to claim the center of our thinking. And for me in the academy, learning to navigate that skillfully, learning to navigate how to hold what is important, what is important strategically to do for us right now, what might be important for us to do for the generations to come, and what is not important. What are the things that might be loud, but if you let them go, they will fall away. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I've come to see that there are amazing things that we can accomplish from our purview in the academy. The question is from what configurations of power in my mind? And are we clear about who gets to decide about those things? And as I've built some programs in the academy and built a whole lot outside the academy, I've learned that there are affordances and constraints to both. And I think for me, the thing that has become clearest is that, part of what I see as a big challenge is I would argue that we have made a lot of strides because of many of the folks that we've already listed, and that there has been big strides in Indigenous intellectuals and scholars, quote, in the academy. I also think that we've gotten to a place where we have to make sure that we don't think that our only job is to build in the academy, so that we are actually utilizing what we are harvesting that is useful into the continual building of our own communities and nations. And so the bounds for what counts, what is worthwhile doing, I think is in flux. I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule about this. But I think for me, I think about my role now is how do we continually build the opportunities for the next generation of scholars to be able to continually do that in more generative ways, in healthier ways for themselves, right? So that the harms of the academy don't get to keep claiming space in any of our lives. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. We're going to transition, but I just want to make a few observations before we do in terms of closing this up. I think there's obviously a lot of room for conversations in here, but I think for me, you all really raised these questions for us to really start with what's possible, or in Susan's words, what's the power of possibility in doing this? And I think what you also named for us is, what are the conditions necessary for making those possible? And I think, Jeremy, when you say, like, what does it mean to arrive at an institution, there's a part of me that like, I love that question. I also think for institutions, we might want to ask them, what does it mean to receive? And what is the power of both arriving and receiving in terms of that within the larger context of how we're thinking about these questions of indigenizing? And then each of you all really is asking us, really demanding of us to think about how we hold ourselves and others accountable in an era that is filled in 500 years of extraction. A number of you all use that word. Fundamentally, we're asking about, how do we keep our institutions accountable, but to whom are we accountable? And I think the answer really is young people, youth, communities is what I hear you all getting at, but I also think it's ourselves, right? And sort of making sure that there's a larger notion here and a thread running through this about the role of power, but also the role of power in the academy, but also what does it mean for us to engage in well-being, meaningful well-being of ourselves and the places we work and the communities for whom we work. So I'm grateful, none of that is mine, that's all yours. So I'm grateful that you all have taken us there. Let's transition a bit. So the center came about in really this historical moment of civil rights movement. And we're actually on the cusp of another historical moment, which is the potential confirmation of the first American Indian cabinet member in the US, Deb Hadland. And I want to ask you all to actually start to engage each other in this around a question. And I should say this question ideally will work within the framework of values that guide your work, because I think you all are talking about values anyway. But here's the question to you, and I'm going to ask you, Dr. Garcia, to begin. What specific goals do you prioritizing in what, let me ask again, sorry. What specific goals do you prioritize in changing or transforming, or at least nudging the academy in different directions, and what things most need to be changed? Dr. Garcia?
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's a great question with a long-standing history in terms of, I appreciate you centering the origins of how the center came to be, and actually recognizing Deb Hadland's role, and certainly my prayers are with her as well, because I think it's long overdue to have someone in that capacity. So I think that for me, I want to sort of tell stories about my sort of pathway to maybe help address what you're asking here. And I think by placing the origins of the center that we celebrate today was born out of a particular movement at the time. And I think that for me, I've come to see the critical or significant role that movements play in how that shapes the things that we do. And I think that we have to listen carefully to what that is, and to be attuned with teasing that out for ourselves, because I think that there's messages in terms of where we go next and how much we have to do to be able to protect ourselves and our communities, but also to think of ways that are innovative, that move us forward as a collective to address certain issues. And I mentioned at some point earlier, we mentioned the idea that I was at Purdue University, and that there, the Native American Education and Cultural Center was actually born out of a movement in itself. It was really facilitated by myself and a few other graduate students who were also there at the time. And the university was wanting to increase the number of Native students attending Purdue University. And when we think about the location of Purdue University, it's in Indiana. So there isn't a high amount of Native communities there. And so a lot of the students were going to be coming in from various locations to be there. And so for us, our concern at that moment was, it's great that you're creating these pathways, but how are you taking care of them once they arrive? And I think that sense of care and well-being that you speak to, Dr. Brayboy, was critical for me, because I could not agree and promote something if I didn't feel like there was a level of understanding and sincerity about why they were doing the work they were doing. And this was really grounded within the sciences. And I think that that experience there helped me really see the realities of how institutions operate. The faculty were great in supporting us, but there was also a learning curve that we ended up embodying and having to facilitate conversations about what has been the history of education, and how does that present itself once Native students arrive at these institutions. And so, long story short, we put forward a proposal. It was granted by the provost's office. I had actually traveled to ASU to interview folks there about the details of the center, so that we could continue to grow and understand what we would like this place to be. And so I'm really happy about the progress it's made. And it was founded in 2016. They've grown, and now they have their own house that's more centralized on campus to be more visible, but also to continue to provide the services and support for Native students. So I think that was one moment for me, that I think, thinking about this idea of movements and historical times that we had to, they shape things. My next stop was at working with Dr. David Bolio at the Electaquini American Indian Institute. There, it was basically just beginning. The Institute was had its inception in 2010, but it was still in its very early phases of what it was going to be and how it was going to be of service. But that actually was born out of a longstanding history that actually occurred in 1970 with three Native women who were demanding a different kind of education. They were pushing back on the Milwaukee public schools at the time, stating that their students weren't receiving the kind of education that represented their identity, and et cetera. So they actually, in relationship to the American Indian movement at the time, there was some alliance going on there that they were able to demand that the origin of the Indian community school. So all of that has informed and led up to, over the years, the inception of the Electaquini American Indian Institute. And then of course, now I'm the co-director of ITIP. And so all of these things and experiences that I've had have resurfaced when I was working with here, arriving at U of A, and having to think through how are we going to design this program? What are things that we have to, what kind of questions are we posing to ourselves and to our colleagues? And are we ready for it? But I think it was born out of the demand from the community. We held a meeting here with all 22 nations in 2016, which their call to action of us was to help support them in the idea of increasing the number of Native teachers in their communities. So that was our accountability to them in that process. The last piece that I want to speak to in terms of this idea of movements and what nudges me is really, again, looking at what we see in our communities. Thinking about Standing Rock, for example, the call to action to protect our sacred sites. Bears Ears, for example, is another place that's under threat at this moment. And then we have also the idea of Oak Flat that is currently, and I want to take time, and I hope that you all can search these, that right now, as we speak, we have Native youth who are running to bring attention to that fight to protect something that is important and sacred to them. So, those are things that I think that help shape the work that I do, but also the accountability and responsibilities that institutions could also be in solidarity with. But again, there's a lot more detail to thinking through and what that might look like. So, that's my immediate response, is that sort of really paying attention to the ways in which movements determine the ways in which we should respond, but it's also, they serve as reminders of the hard work that's still yet to come.
Thank you. Either Susan or Megan, Doctors Faircloth or Bang, you want to weigh in on either a response to Jeremy or your own thoughts on this? Go ahead.
I'll go first, Susan. And just to add to this, I appreciate, Jeremy, what you've articulated here, it made me think about a couple of things that I'll just say. When I took my first job in the academy, I had come from a place where I was like, nope, I'm not going to be a professor after graduate school. And I was a director of education of a community organization for a long time. And I just was like, nope, that place is not for me. I can live a good life, a life that actually feels like I'm doing the work that I'm called to do, the heart work, the things that I have gifts for, in a different location. And I actually had an elder who was like, not your right to say no. We don't have enough people, go. It took me a while to figure out this new role until I really got to know. And then I moved to someone else's territories and I had to understand what it meant to live off my own territories, even though I'm a multi-generational urban person, right? I live on my ancestral territories. And part of why I'll say that is because when I came to the Pacific Northwest and thought about the movements to require the teaching of tribal history and sovereignty, I was both really compelled by that, and I was trying to understand how these movements were going to be different than some of the other movements in other states that had maybe similar, maybe not quite so much, had different teeth. And I am extraordinarily grateful for Senator McCoy's mentorship and his capacity as a leader to engage me and say, so what do you think? And I remember we were in a Starbucks and he said, what should we do next? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not even from here. I've only been here for a couple of years. What do I know? And he was like, come on, you know these institutions. And we ended up talking a lot about what it looked like to get upstream. And I had said to him at that point, this is really good, but we have no trained teachers to know how to do this. So we're going to ask our schools and our educators to do something that they don't know and they've never been trained to do. So I said, I really think we need to figure out how to get upstream, create actually ongoing systems and capacity to do the things that our communities know we need. And I think about that ask a lot and what it meant for me to say, I didn't think I was going to go and create a program. I didn't think I was going to help pen legislation. I didn't think I was going to do the work of intervening with teacher education certificate boards. I was kind of, I don't know what I'm doing then, but it was what was asked of me. And it was asked of me because it helped to create the conditions downstream that our communities needed. So when I think about what is asked of us and what it means for us to keep being adaptive, one of the things that I often say to my students is, the academy teaches people to think that it's all about their own intellectual freedom, not our intellectual responsibility to our communities and what it looks like to do that. And so, I think about that a lot on the one hand. On the other hand, I also think a lot about the base conditions that we shift. And in my own work, what I've been after is really, it's not that deep, but we keep extracting kiddos from their families and from their lands and putting them in boxes. And then keeping them in those boxes for 6 to 8 hours a day and telling them to learn. We've been doing it for generations. And I had another mentor sort of say to me, we've been conditioned to participate in the ceding of our children's time to those arrangements of life. And so for me, part of what I've been after, and I've been doing this for 20 years, I have been running land-based programs in the summer with kids and families and communities for more than 20 years. And I've been doing those in community settings, not as connected to the university. And so I'll just say that I think that, Jeremy, you named some of the different movements that are happening. And I think that we can think about the different scales of movement that create the everyday conditions for our thriving. And it makes me think a lot about, Vine Deloria and Dan Wildcat's work of saying that what we should be after is recreating the conditions for our thriving. And these movements are often about removing conditions that actually prevent our thriving.
Thank you. Dr. Faircloth, you want to weigh in here?
So I'll try to weave this story succinctly. And Dr. Brayboy, as a Southerner at heart, sometimes our stories can be a bit rambling. So I'll try to make this succinctly. So I go back to the original question that we were asked in preparing for today was, what values guide the work that you do both inside and outside of the academy? And so I'll tell a quick story about Dr. Brayboy, and then I want to go back to two mentors who I think have really impacted the way in which I try to do my work. So I think, I had a similar experience to Dr. Bang, that when I graduated from Penn State in December of 2000, I graduated from the American Indian Leadership Program, which was a program that at that time was the oldest continuously operating leadership program for American Indians in the nation, and had ties to Arizona State University, Harvard, and other programs. And so the person who was directing that program at that time was Dr. John Tipiconic. Dr. Tipiconic also served as a director of the center at Arizona State. And it's funny because it took us it took for me, and I'm similar to you, Megan, I'm very much an introvert at heart. And so it took me a while before we formed this really solid relationship. But the one person who reached out to me today before this session was John Tipiconic. And I've known him 20 years, and I still call him Dr. Tipiconic, or Tip, never John. And he texted me and he said, so I'm going to join this session, but I have to leave in 54 minutes to go to something else, but I'm going to join it. And I said, I'm a bit nervous to be on a panel with Jeremy and Megan. They have such great things to say. And he said to me, you've got great things in your own way. And I said to him, that's why I love you so much, in a fatherly, mentorly and way. And he came back and said, in an old frog way, right? And so I think about, he's always been that person who just has such a gentle heart and gentle spirit. And I've only heard him once in 20 years like lose his temper, right? And I knew that he meant it when that happened. But he's always been that person to remind me of why I do this work, and that this work is not about the academy, but it's about our people. And that transitions to this experience with you, Dr. Brayboy. When I first graduated from Penn State with that doctoral degree, I remember walking across campus, and it was a cold and rainy, snowy, dreary day, as it's often apt to be in central Pennsylvania in winter. And I felt this heaviness, like if anybody says anything to me, I'll just cry. And it was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, graduating with this doctoral degree and doing great things. And I struggled with that. I didn't feel like I was ready to be a faculty member. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, right? I needed to find myself. And I ended up working with the tribal colleges. And as I said, unlearned in just a few days, everything I learned as a doctoral student. And then worked there for a couple of years before being recruited back to Penn State as a faculty member and as co-director of this very American Indian leadership program that had started my journey. And I remember seeing you, Dr. Brayboy, at an AERA, I think it was in San Francisco, and we were passing in the hallway, and you're like, Dr. Faircloth, every time I see you, your head is down and you're worrying about promotion and tenure, and you need to get over yourself. And he said, if one day you'll reach a point, I'm paraphrasing you, where you'll realize that these institutions will exist with or without you. It's really not about you. And if you can get to that point, your life will be so much better, right? And you'll really find your purpose. And I share that story quite often because I had to get over myself, and I had to really find the why of why I do this work. And it's not about promotion and tenure, right? I think the academy pays me and allows me to do the things that I really want to do, right? But that's not what's most important to me. And so then I think about the wisdom from Dr. Tipiconic, and I also think about the wisdom from a non-native person, Gary Orfield, who mentored me at the Civil Rights Project. And he asked me about, who do you want to use to read and use your work? And he talked to me about having people who had a high school education being able to read and access my work, and that those are the people who really matter. And so when I write, I really try to write in a way that my grandmothers who have recently passed could read, or my aunties, my uncles, my mother. I want other academics to read it, but I really want the people to read it, right, and to be able to access it. And so when I think about those values, I think I'm led by this. There are two really competing values. One is a great sense of obligation. I think about my mother, who worked for 37 years in a hog slaughtering factory so that I could go to college. Didn't want to do that work, but she wanted her children to have better choices and opportunities. And I think about all the people during the the self-determination movement of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, who went to these predominantly white institutions and created the Center for Indian Ed, or the American Indian Leadership Program, so that people like me, first generation college goers, American Indian, Alaska Native students, could have these opportunities. And I think about how difficult those places and spaces were for them to be removed from their families. And I think about all the sacrifices and all the work that they did. And I remember that day that I graduated. When I think about why I was sad because I didn't feel that I had what it took to be able to give honor to those people who had given so much so that I could have these opportunities and that I could make a difference. And so when I wake up each morning, I wake up with a great sense of joy that I get paid to think about Indian Ed. I get paid to read and to think and to do the work I'm most passionate about. But I also have a nagging sensation that I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing it right. I'm not doing it in a good way. And I think that that keeps me rooted and grounded. So it's that value of reciprocity. It's that value of community. It's that value of thinking about, as we say in the South, who are my people, right? And that my people don't always exist within the academy. And that's okay. I'll end by saying, you know, when our daughter was born, Jeremy sent us a gift of Hopi dolls and toys, which we kept in the nursery. I think about Megan opening up an opportunity for me to meet with women of color leaders in the academy. And so I think about all the gifts that I've received and how blessed I am. And I go back to my mentor, John Tipiconic. All that he has ever asked me over the years is to give back to the next generation of scholars in the same way that he gave me. And I can't think of anything that I would be any more blessed to do than to be able to work in the realm of Indigenous scholars and to be able to make some small impact on Indigenous communities and children and little ones. That's just very blessed, sacred work, I think.
Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to Jeremy and Megan in just a moment and ask you for 2 minutes on what is your why. But before I do that, let me just try to close some of this up, because I think that's where you've taken us, Susan, Dr. Faircloth, and all of this is really that fundamental question about why, which is what we should be asking ourselves. But I think where you all have taken me in this is fundamentally around larger questions of time and temporality in this. Movements get started in a moment that is absolutely linked to a past, whether it's the creation of a center or the change of a bill since time immemorial, which you helped get going, Megan, in Washington State, or the House in at Purdue for you, Jeremy, but also the cession of time, that is the giving away of it, the demand of it, and whether it's from our children or whether it's from us in the process of trying to help an institution or institutions that aren't really there for us. So I think the cession of time, the temporality of that really emerges for me. What are the conditions for the future? All of you all talked about beginnings and emergences. And certainly some question a long time ago about origins of a place, but there is something about the conditions of the future that you all have all talked around, all located in the importance of the past. And so you've drawn this timeline for us in all of this as well. You've each talked about what does it mean to move a community forward, right? All with a respectful eye toward the fact that communities know what they need. And so institutions then get to weigh in on helping them, right, create futures that for them are really important. And then I think each of you has talked a bit about the role of how we evolve in our thinking, how we adapt, who we adjust. There are moments when people see us as these things that are stuck in dioramas, right, in the past as fixed. And I think what you all are doing is really busting this open for us and saying, well, Native peoples have always adapted and adjusted. We've always done that. And we've also always traveled and migrated. This is some of the work that Natalie Diaz is starting to work around, but I think we are all talking about, you all are all talking about that. So for me, that's the big takeaway, is time or temporality in your answers. So just as a closing up, so we've got about we've got a few minutes before we're going to go to audience questions, but I'm wondering, Megan, I just in a very short time, like, what's your why?
So I come from a family that has been impacted. And for me, I live in a time where my job is to open up the next world. But my person is that as well. And so I'll just say that part of what it is I'm a cancer survivor, didn't think I was gonna have children. And I've raised lots of my nieces and nephews. And I'll tell you my why is because I had to learn how to be a good relative that wasn't locked into that I thought that I was the end, that I couldn't have babies in some ways. And it first taught me about really holding the value of extended families and understanding that, but also understanding, and I do this all the time, is I ask people, what are the traditional stories of these times that our people will tell in 500 years, in 1,000 years? And so my why is always trying to think about how am I contributing to birthing the stories of these times that, and this is kind of my daughter tells me this is a hokey prayer, but I really love it, is may we raise our babies with our Indigenous love and not our colonial pain. And they tell me I'm memeified or something like that. I don't really know. I'm old enough to not really understand. But my why is really, how am I actually doing what is necessary in these times for the continuation of our peoples? And doing it in such a way where the stories before about how we would have to pick up the things along our path, that we knew that there would be a time where we were picking up the things along our path. That is my why. And I guess I'll just say, for me, it's increasingly about how am I a good mother? How am I a good grandmother? I'm in this phase of life where I have grandbabies, and the shift in why I do the things has been pretty powerful, to move from scrambling to survive to raise my own kiddos or my nieces and nephews to also helping the next generation raise theirs. I've always done that as an educator. It's always been my favorite part. But this sort of, my own maturation into this has been really about how am I a good grandma? How am I a good mom?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that. I appreciate Dr. Faircloth and Dr. Bang, the taking us to a place that is personal, and the why is really grounded in that personal interaction. And Dr. Faircloth, we met back in maybe 2008 or so under a project of Dr. Maynette Benham, who brought a series of scholars together to think together, to dream together, and to which led to a book, In Our Mother's Voice book. But in there, what I go to, there's a story that I talk about being myself as a father of a Hopi, young Hopi girl, and making the trips back to Hopi during ceremonies or for whatever other reasons. But on those trips, I write about this idea that there's always an abundance of questions of why. Why does Hopi do this? Why do these Katsinas do this? What is this song about? What is it saying, and so forth. And I always felt discomforted in the fact that I could only answer so far. And to me, that is the motivation of the why that we do this work. Why this, when we think about indigenizing pedagogies, for example, it has to be done from within and for a different purpose, for their own purposes. And I go to the experience of working with the Hopi Natwani Coalition, coalition, where they were looking at sustaining traditional farming processes and practices. And when we jumped into the work, it was very evident that there was a process of a critical analysis that needed to happen before we could even think about what does it mean to have a curriculum that's grounded within farming practices. And through that process, we start to come to see ourselves and to engage in recentering indigenous concepts in relationship to planting. And for Hopi, corn is plays an essential role in our identity. And so we know that we're always, from that process, I'll just say that they reaffirm for me that this work that we do is so critical, and that we have to be intentional about creating spaces for that to happen. And it has to be under our own terms and conditions. And it doesn't have to be about proving to any external context of why this knowledge is important and critical, but as long as it's important to us, And so that's one moment, or I guess two, that really helped me contextualize and think about the why I do this work. And the last thing that I'll just say, that I think it also helps prepare me for thinking about how we have to be protectors of our own Native students that arrive at our campus. And I want to highlight that there is the incident that you all may be familiar with that happened here at the University of Arizona with an exchange with the Native SOAR students, interactions with President Robbins and the Vice Provost, Lysel Folks, in terms of the microaggressions that they encountered. It really, it was a painful interaction that they shared. And I know that maybe you, Dr. Brayboy, have also been a mentor to them to help the students who were engaging with that, and the directors, to be able to find ways to respond and to push back. And I think that was the calling for solidarity with my own colleagues in the College of Education who center Native American or Indigenous studies, to be able to put forward in writing the concerns that we have with that and why it's problematic. But I think that we are only able to do that in very specific ways because we are always rooted in our own communities and Indigenous knowledge and value systems to help reaffirm why it's problematic. So that is sort of the whys that I think it's prepared me for those moments where I do have to be in solidarity with Native students.
Thank you. So we're going to transition in just a moment to questions from the audience. Each of you makes me think about the role and importance of relationality. And I know each of you all has talked about that throughout the questions, but if we think about the why, right? Megan, I love your memeified prayer about raising our babies with love rather than our pain. It disrupts cycles of trauma. By doing that, it in your words, sort of hearkening back to Scott Lyons, it resets the terms of the debate in terms of where we start and where we begin. I think that there is, for us as Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems, we are primarily interested in the continuance and maintenance of who we are as peoples in relation to place, regardless of where that place is. And so you are really driving, for me, the why is towards some end of self-determination, for us to set the terms of the debate for our futures in terms of where we're going. So as we begin to transition to, thank you for that. And I want to thank each of you all for, one, agreeing to do this. I know you are really busy. You are important people where you are. You are important people to the Center for Indian Education. We rely on your work. We rely on you. So let me just personally thank you for that. And let me also, in my hat as director of the center, make a shameless plug in terms of what you all have said in terms of thinking about the future, which is we have this online master's degree in Indigenous education at ASU. And so that link's going up in the in our YouTube site if you're interested in learning more. I know others are developing programs as well. We will make sure that there's information out there about other programs that you all have as well. So I want to just sort of call your attention to that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Colin Ben, who's going to pull in some questions from the audience for us. We'll have about 10 minutes total for those before we close out at the bottom of the hour. So Dr. Ben.
Thank you, Dr. Brayboy, for that. I first would like to thank our audience for joining us from areas throughout Indian country and from multiple states. We have people joining us from Illinois, Tucson, as far up as Montana, New Mexico, and Oregon, to name a few. So for those of you who join us on YouTube, thank you for submitting your questions. For those of you who had submitted your questions when you did register for the webinar, thank you for that. So I'll begin with the first question to the panelists. How can STEM educators in higher education incorporate ways to indigenize the field, especially in engineering? Megan, can we start with you?
You can form partnerships with tribal nations and ask them how engineering can help build self-determination. I mean, I think this goes back to my point about I'm concerned about the academy wanting to indigenize and be a bit intrigued by Indigenous knowledge systems, but think that they can engage them without our persons. And so I have a lot, and I'm really appreciative of people who are wondering about these things, but you can't do them not in partnership. And even you just heard, for everyone who may not think about it this way, each of us just explained our work in deep partnership with communities. And so I think that is the first thing I would say is I would spend some time building relationship with tribal communities and thinking about how the discipline of engineering could contribute to the well-being of our communities.
Doctors Garcia or Faircloth, would you like to comment?
I think Dr. Bang hit it on the head.
Yes, I think my only comment is that it really, that question pushes me to think about, as the ITEP director, how do we prepare our Native teacher candidates to understand and engage science or STEM related fields? And I think that we had our first taste of thinking through that, knowing that we would love to do the work that Dr. Bang does in terms of being in the communities, being on the land, outside of the institutions. But I think our first round of indigenizing of the idea of looking at how we prepare our Native teacher candidates to reconceptualize science, we went straight to our elders. We were able to weave them in through dialogue around the work that they're doing. For instance, there's Vernon Masaiswa, who's been a long advocate for resisting issues around water extraction through the Peabody coal mining system, which did end. They were flushing a lot of fresh water, pumping fresh water to transport coal. So when you think about the socio-cultural political context of what is STEM and what does it mean in relation to our communities and what does it look like, for us, that was our approach to engaging our students, to really think through that and be in conversation with elders and to hear from them firsthand. This is what our youth need to understand, and this is what they need to know based on their own traditional perspectives. Let's say, for example, from a Hopi lens, why is water critical? So I think that those are certainly beginning points, and it does have to be in relation with communities, with outcomes and solutions that actually go back to the idea of sovereignty that's been mentioned here.
Thank you for your responses. The next question is, what would it take for us to establish a tribal college and university with R1 university infrastructure?
If only we had someone on here who had worked at AHEC before.
I'm trying to think of how to respond to that question. John Tipiconic and I did write just a small text. I think it's like 40 or 50 pages, and it would have been published in the early 2000s. And you can Google it. It's publicly accessible, and it talks about what's needed to establish a tribal college. So I think that's one resource. But I'm not sure that's the right question about how to establish a tribal college with R1 resources. I think for me, the establishment of a tribal college is not the replication. It's not replicating a currently existing model. And I think that conversation really has to begin and end, as Megan and Jeremy have both said, in partnership with those tribal communities. Is that something that they want? What does it look like? And so I think it's a different set of questions that needs to be asked. When I worked with the tribal colleges, one of the first things that I was asked to do was to prepare a document for the Office of Budget and Management. And it was a budget document that detailed resources and spending, comparing the 1994 land grant tribal colleges to other mainstream, if you want to call them that, land grant institutions. And I said to them, it's like comparing apples and oranges. Tribal colleges have never even received the base funding that they were promised, with the per student based funding that they were promised in the original land grant tribal college legislation. And so we're so far behind in terms of that base funding to compare us to R1 institutions, I really think is not coming at it from the best approach. Others may differ in that, but I think tribal colleges were created to meet a different need, right? To operate in a different way. And so those questions about their establishment are critically important.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Faircloth. The next question is, many tribal members have sought higher education in the past years, but don't return to their respective tribes to work, when the goal was to get educated and return to help their tribal nations in masters of self-sufficiency. To what degree will this trend continue, and how can this be addressed?
If I could offer something just briefly, there's an article that I wrote back in the 2000s, and it's in the Journal of Research on Rural Education, and it was in response to a book written by a Canadian, Michael Corbett, and he asked the question about what is the purpose of rural education. So this is not talking about higher ed, but it's the purpose of K-12 education. In the book that he wrote is talking about educating our children to leave, right? That the purpose of education is, and this is not focused on Indigenous or Native children, but children and youth in general. The purpose of education is to prepare us to leave our communities for something better, something bigger. And so my response to that, thinking about Indigenous children and youth, was that we need to think about education in a different way. That for me, there are three different purposes of education. One could very well be to educate us to leave our communities and pursue other opportunities. One purpose could be to prepare us to remain in our communities. And a third option could be to prepare us to leave and to return when we're ready, or when our communities are ready for us. And I think about myself as an Indigenous person. I compare myself to I have a niece, her name is Kanani. Her father is Native Hawaiian, her mother is Mexican American, American Indian. She grew up in urban Honolulu and then returned to North Carolina. And I so admire Kanani's ability to be able to just shift between her Native Hawaiian elders and communities and urban Hawaiian setting, and then shift to her Southern relatives, Indigenous Native Kahari relatives. And I think that that's something that I've struggled with as a Native person in the academy. Is I go home and I feel increasingly less comfortable. I go into the academy and I feel increasingly less comfortable. And I think it's just this very troubled relationship, right? The more I get, the more I feel comfortable in one place, the less I feel comfortable in another. And so I think that, yes, more and more of our Native academics or scholars or people who have education should be able to return to our communities. But I also think, and Dr. Brayboy, you could probably speak to this as well. I think about if I want to work in a university, the closest university to my tribal homelands is an hour and a half away. And they don't always come after me, right? And so I think sometimes the more educated we get in a very westernized way, the more difficult it is to return to our communities. I'm not saying that's right, but I think it's not always our decision where we go. And I think for me, many of the decisions that I've made throughout my career have not been decisions that Susan Faircloth made. There were opportunities that were created for me and that I had to say yes to. And so my elders, both within and outside of the academy, paved that pathway. And I think, Megan, you've given examples of that. They paved those pathways, they created those opportunities. And I went where I was supposed to be, and not necessarily where Susan wanted to go, but where my elders said, this is where you need to be.
To build on what Susan has just said, I just want to offer this. I think that there is a role for our institutions to think about this, because Susan, I appreciate the kind of three pathways you've named. I do think our institutions tend to privilege one of those pathways, right? The institutional infrastructures think about extraction, leaving. And in my work with educators, one of the things that I have to get them to do is recognize their classism in that. And the ways that I've done that is to say, if you keep telling kiddos that if they go and get an education, they don't have to be fisher folk like their dads, you are participating in the violence. But many educators haven't stopped to think about what that means or what that looks like. And so I would just say that I think that what is exciting to me about the kind of critical mass that that question is recognizing is that there are opportunities for us to transform the universities so that the multiple pathways that Susan is talking about actually can manifest differently, that we might have different institutional arrangements with tribal communities that actually make normal the migrations from home to universities, to home, right, to other homes. So that some of the, I sometimes think that these movements still deeply have a kind of settler colonial territorialization underneath them. They don't actually have deliberately thinking about our migrations and our pathways that have always been good for us, right? Interfacing with other peoples wasn't thought about as a bad thing originally. But there's a way in which they're very Cartesian and linear in about this. So I think that for a while we've seen many elders, many people that came before us who willed those multiple pathways and figured out how to make those relationships. And I guess for me, you all are hearing I'm like on this all the time at my own university these days, that I was like, you have to set up the institutional relationships. It cannot be individuals' responsibility to do all of this.
And Megan, if I could just speak to that too, I think I had a situation yesterday where we were looking at a strategic plan, and there's one reference in that strategic plan to the mission of the land-grant institution being to include and work with Indigenous peoples, and then nowhere else in that strategic plan does it reference Indigenous peoples. And I said, you can say all you want to that our mission is to work with and honor Indigenous peoples, but if you don't lay out how you're going to do that, it's really just a statement. And second of all, you can't just, or you should not just develop that document, right, and then go to Indigenous peoples and say, here's our plan on how we're going to engage you, and they're supposed to accept it. That there has to be a partnership from the beginning, right? A true partnership, and not just a partnership that exists in a document. And I think that institutions are still grappling with that no, don't come to us after you've already thought through how this partnership or collaboration is going to work. Because maybe Indigenous communities don't want to work with your organization. Maybe it's not the right mix, right? And so I think there has to be a rethinking of how we approach Indigenous peoples and involve them in that process.
Thank you all. We need 2.5 or 3 hours. We probably need a whole day for this. So I am grateful for a fantastic discussion on this, and for you all bringing your experience and expertise into this. Many thanks to each of you all, Dr. Megan Bang, Dr. Jeremy Garcia, Dr. Susan Faircloth, for joining us today. I've already made a quick plug about our master's degree. I want to really remind you about our next webinar, the fourth in our series of 5, which is called The Future of Indigenous Education. And it's please mark your calendars for March 26, 2021. It'll be 1 to 2:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and it will feature Dr. Daryl Joseph, who's Hopi and an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Leilani Subsalian is a LUTIC assistant professor at Oregon. Dr. Valerie Shirley, who's Dene, an assistant professor at University of Arizona, and Dr. Ananda Moran, who's Choctaw and African American and assistant professor at UCLA, is going to be moderating that. You all can't see what I'm seeing, but behind the scenes to make this work, I really want to thank Dr. Debbie Chadwick at the center, Dr. Colin Ben, Jim Salisbury, who does all of the technical work, Jeannie Colquitt, and Taylor Nota, who she and her team are responsible for all of our information that you see out there, the visual representations of it. Thank all of you all, the panel. Thank you, the audience, for staying with us. We look forward to seeing you on March the 26th, and the last 5/5 of our versions of this will be on April 23rd. Until then, we are all wishing you good health and safety for you and your families. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.